We have some new details emerging about the arrest of one of Mexico's Sinaloa cartel's most notorious kingpins. Ismael El Mayo Zambada's lawyer releasing a two-page letter Saturday detailing the circumstances of his arrest, alleging he was kidnapped by rival drug lord Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of the sons of the infamous El Chapo, who was arrested in 2014. The news coming a day after the U.S. ambassador to Mexico confirmed the cartel leader had been, quote, taken against his will.
We're going to talk about two kidnappings. One, admittedly and undoubtedly committed by the United States government a number of years ago, and a second one that happened in July of this year.
I'm second generation DA with Los Angeles County. My dad was a district attorney for 22 years, from 1970 to 1992. And the jobs that we've done, there are things you can do that you just can't do anywhere else. The stories are unbelievable. Very quickly, though, I got involved in a huge police corruption case called the Rampart police corruption scandal involving the Rampart crash anti-gang unit.
A DEA agent who worked in the Guadalajara, Mexico office named Enrique Camarena, Camarena, he was kidnapped. And the kidnapping was done by Guadalajara police officers working on behalf of the drug cartel. How do you feel about the U.S. government orchestrating the kidnapping of a foreign national in a foreign country and bringing him to the United States to stand trial? The Chief, Mark Garrett, how are you today?
I'm doing fine.
Mark, today, man, I think a fascinating show. We're going to talk about two kidnappings. One, admittedly and undoubtedly committed by the United States government a number of years ago. Darn near, what, 30 years ago?
30 years ago, 32, I think, is it?
Yeah, and a second one that happened in July of this year. And there's some question still as to exactly what happened, but we'll get into that a little bit. We have a special guest to discuss these two cases with and to get some kind of expert legal opinion and kind of discuss what could happen, where we might end up with this high profile case. And of course, I'm talking about Mayo Zambada. Mayo Zambada, who arrived in Santa Teresa, New Mexico on July 25th of this year with Joaquin Guzman Lopez. Joaquin 100% turned himself in. That had been negotiated for a while, and Mayo's still a little bit up in the air about what happened, but we'll get into that in a little more detail after we introduce our guest. Our guest, someone I had the pleasure to work with and know for a good portion of my career. His name is Sean Carney, a longtime prosecutor at the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, I think 26 plus years. I knew him, of course, for his time in the Major Narcotics Unit, but he's prosecuted arsons, organized crime, police corruption. He's really done it all and has a diverse prosecutorial background. And interestingly, the thing that I didn't know about him until just recently was he clerked for Judge John Davies, U.S. District Court Judge. And part of one of the cases that we're going to discuss today actually ended up in Judge Davies' courtroom. And that's where our guest today, Mr. Sean Carney, became familiar with it. So, Sean, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show here.
Thanks, Bill, for having me. And it's my pleasure. I clerked for Davies in 1995. And I think he had handled the case we're going to talk about, Alvarez-Machain, the year before. But I had some minor after stuff to deal with. And I got fascinated with the case right away, just reading the record.
Right. And Sean, before we get to that, how did you end up becoming a prosecutor? What was it about, was it something that you always wanted to do? Was it in law school? Was it maybe when you clerked for Judge Davies, you said, wow, this is something I want to get into? How did that come about?
Yeah, actually, I'm second generation DA with Los Angeles County. My dad was a district attorney for 22 years, from 1970 to 1992. So when I was growing up, I heard the stories and all the different things that he did. As you know, in the jobs that we've done, there are things you can do that you just can't do anywhere else. The stories are unbelievable. And I was hooked. And so I worked a little bit before law school as a private investigator, actually. And then after doing that for a bit, went to law school. Actually did pretty well in law school. And so ended up getting a clerkship with John Davies, who was in the Central District at the time. And then after him, worked a little bit doing white collar defense in a private firm. But as soon as the DA's office had an opening, I was in.
That's
And I've
awesome.
been there, yeah, ever since.
And when you started at the DA's office in LA County, what was the flavor for what you did as a young prosecutor?
Yeah, I had a little bit of an unusual path. And by the way, let me just premise my comments by saying that although I do work for them, the LA County District Attorney's Office, I'm here in my individual capacity, so I'm not speaking on behalf of the office. And my opinions are my own. None of the information I'm talking about today is derived from any confidential sources. So just with that disclaimer, when I first started in the office, like typical DAs, I started doing misdemeanor trials. Eventually, pulled down some felony trials. Very quickly, though, I got involved in a huge police corruption case called the Rampart police corruption scandal involving the Rampart crash
Oh, yeah.
anti-gang unit.
Remember it well.
Yeah, so that was a case where we formed a task force specifically to handle because there was such a huge number of potential criminal prosecutions. And because I had a strong writing background working for a firm and for a federal judge, my office pulled me into that on the trial team. I was the youngest guy on that trial team. And that was a huge exposure for a young DA into some fascinating cases. And then not long after that, I got into major narcotics. And I worked all kinds of major narcotics investigations involving first the Arellano Felix organization.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they faded and Sinaloa took over, tons of cases involving the Sinaloa cartel, including El Mayo's organization.
Yep.
And subordinates of El Mayo.
Yeah, I remember those days. I guess that kind of leads us to the subject at hand, and I think important probably to talk about the old case first. So the idea of today's show for me was to kind of compare the kidnapping of Alvarez-Machain to the kidnapping of Mayo Zambada. And for people who have never heard of Alvarez-Machain or don't know what we're talking about, I can give a little bit of background. In February 1985, a DEA agent who worked in the Guadalajara, Mexico office named Enrique Camarena, Kiki Camarena, he was kidnapped. And the kidnapping was done by Guadalajara police officers working on behalf of the drug cartel. He was taken to a house and tortured over the course of several days. The drug traffickers wanted to know what he knew, what the DEA knew about their drug trafficking organization. At that time, it was the Guadalajara cartel, kind of I guess I would say the original drug cartel in Mexico, or one of. The beating was brutal. The torture was brutal. And the drug traffickers actually brought in a doctor, Humberto Alvarez-Machain, and the doctor basically, his job was to keep Camarena alive so the torture could continue and they could try to still get information out of him. And I know, at least one of the things that was done is adrenaline was used, injected to try to keep Camarena coherent and able to answer questions as the beatings and the torture continued. Eventually, he succumbed to his injuries. The traffickers took him and dumped him, and it turned into, what probably is even still today the largest homicide investigation that the federal government has ever conducted. Humberto Alvarez-Machain was charged for his role in his role in conspiracy, keeping, injecting drugs, keeping Camarena alive during the torture, etc. And on April 2nd, he was abducted from his medical office in Mexico by, I think, really another group of Guadalajara police officers, or at least Jalisco, maybe state police officers. I don't recall exactly which it was. But that kidnapping was orchestrated, admittedly, by the Drug Enforcement Administration, by the U.S. government. They orchestrated that kidnapping. Alvarez-Machain was taken, flown to El Paso, and he ended up, standing trial or at least appearing before the court in Los Angeles. Sean, somewhat unusual for someone to meet justice like that. And I talked to
Yeah.
you about this before. I don't know, is the proper term rendition when someone is kind of grabbed from a country outside of the extradition treaty, or does that really have nothing to do with it? Or what is the term for what happened there?
Yeah, there's not hard and fast definitions, but rendition is sort of synonymous with extradition. That would be the regular surrendering of a person by one government to another under legal process. Um, Part of the issues in Mexico and U.S. extradition relationships is under the treaty, Mexico is not obligated to extradite anybody if they are a national of Mexico. And often what has happened on the border is these sort of informal exchanges between officers of Mexico and the United States, where they do what has been referred to it sometimes as irregular rendition, which is like, we're not going through the formal extradition treaty, but we're just exchanging guys, wink, wink, nod, nod, basically, because the extradition process between Mexico and the U.S. has been so difficult. So this is sort of a irregular rendition of a sort. The U.S. Supreme Court called it a abduction or a kidnapping, which the difference between an arrest and a kidnapping is legal authority to do it in the place that it happens.
Right. So Mark,
Yeah.
just let me ask you, as a proud American that you are, how do you feel about the U.S. government orchestrating the kidnapping of a foreign national in a foreign country and bringing him to the United States to stand trial?
Well, from an emotional point of view, they would do it to us, so we do it to them in this case. That's my emotional side speaking. It's not my legal side, law enforcement and wanting to adhere to MOUs between respective countries. That's kind of a different topic, but uh, I'm sure that if Mexico could get away with these types of operations, they would do it as often as they could. That's my gut feeling.
Right.
My question about this, uh, and this goes sorry to both of you, but I think primarily Sean, to you too, Bill, because a DEA agent, SAC, when the DEA when they really conspired with the local authorities in Mexico to kidnap this doctor to bring him over here, do you think that they actually circumvented, Sean, the treaty process because they did not want to give his identity away? They did not want to alert this person as to what was happening. In other words, Mexico, because they won't extradite a citizen over here, they will certainly alert him. Do you think this is part of the reason they actually did this?
Yeah, there's been longstanding frustration between the United States and Mexico. One of the things that over extradition, one of the things that is unique about Mexico is their laws give them the right to try Mexican nationals for crimes committed anywhere abroad.
Mhm.
And so, one of the reasons for their stand on not agreeing to mandatory extradition when Mexican nationals commit crimes abroad is they say they can try them in Mexico. But of
Right.
course, examples of that involving Chapo Guzman and others show that that is often not satisfactory to the United States. And so that frustration is absolutely what led to the situation in Alvarez-Machain, where the government actually tried informally negotiating with the Mexican National Judicial Police, the Federal Judicial Police, were unable to obtain an agreement informally to get Alvarez-Machain to the United States. That wasn't even extradition. They were just going to have an informal swap of Machain for another Mexican national that was in the United States that was wanted for stealing from politicians in Mexico. That fell apart because the Mexican Judicial Police wanted $50K up front for expenses. And the DEA said, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. And it fell apart. And then they ended up contacting these former federal and local police officers. And I think there may have been actually two actual police officers that were on the squad that went to Alvarez-Machain's office and took him at gunpoint.
Yeah, and that kind of clarifies. It helps me solidify my position to your question, Bill. Is that if this is the only way, or certainly the most likely way that we can get one of these types of people, a
Mm,
doctor who's actually aiding and abetting the torture and the murder of a U.S. federal official, then so be it.
yeah. And I mean, the irony is not lost on me that it was Guadalajara police officers that kidnapped Kiki Camarena, and then now other police officers, the U.S. government hired them to kidnap Dr. Alvarez-Machain. I mean, that's unusual. And Sean, is it so? I guess take the next step
Hmm.
as we approach the trial of Alvarez. The judge at the time was Rafeedie.
Yeah.
The defense made a huge issue out of how the doctor arrived in the United States. I mean, that was really their whole defense was he shouldn't be here. This was, an illegal, it was egregious government or outrageous government conduct, the kidnapping.
Yep.
But I think an important part was, am I right that, or I should say, am I right that it was an important part that Mexico actually filed I guess, a formal protest of how this was done,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's right. That played a part in the proceedings. So the defense in Alvarez-Machain brought two claims. One was outrageous government misconduct, as you just mentioned, based on the kidnapping. And then the second one was that Alvarez-Machain was rendered to the United States in violation of the extradition treaty with Mexico. And one of his claims is that that violation of treaty, which becomes U.S. law when it's adopted as a treaty by the U.S. Senate, affirmed by the president, that deprived the U.S. of jurisdiction to try him. And that was one of the big claims. Now, Judge Rafeedie at the trial level heard the governmental misconduct claim, and that claim requires truly outrageous government behavior, like they tortured him. And Alvarez-Machain claimed that the guys who kidnapped him shocked him with shock probes and injected him with drugs and beat him. The problem for that claim, as found by the courts, both Rafeedie and the subsequent civil case, was that when he got to the United States, he was examined by a doctor. He had no injuries. He didn't complain of being tortured. There was no evidence that he had been tortured. So Rafeedie dismissed the outrageous governmental misconduct claim because it just wasn't outrageous enough. So he was only left with this argument that you could not kidnap him and bring him to trial in the United States because it violated the extradition treaty. And that issue went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that is not going to deprive us from trying you of crimes. No matter how you got to the United States, you can still be tried for the crimes once you're here. There's only really two small exceptions to that. One is the outrageous governmental misconduct, and the other is if it's in direct violation of the extradition treaty. And the Supreme Court said, there's nothing in the treaty that prevents kidnappings. The treaty doesn't address it. And not only that, Mexico knew for 90 years that it was the doctrine in U.S. law that it doesn't matter how you get here, we're still going to have jurisdiction to try you. And Mexico had tried to negotiate provisions to prevent that, but they wouldn't. And to this day, they have not wanted to give up their right not to extradite nationals. And so there's never been an agreement that there can't be renditions outside of the extradition treaty. So the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, the extradition treaty doesn't forbid it. It's not in the treaty. So we're not going to deprive ourselves of jurisdiction to try you for that crime. That has huge importance for the current case against El Mayo.
It absolutely does.
It
And
does.
interestingly, Sean, if I'm not mistaken, Rafeedie, the trial judge in the Central District, he dismissed the indictment against Alvarez-Machain. Am I correct in that?
Yeah.
And it was appealed to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit actually affirmed and said that was the correct decision. But all this time, Alvarez continued to be held in custody. He was not released right away. And it went to the Supreme Court, and that's when the Supreme Court issued that decision that you just spoke of. Defendant's forcible abduction from a foreign country, despite the existence of an extradition treaty, does not prohibit him from being tried before a U.S. court.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, Sean, we haven't talked about kind of your inside knowledge of this case. There's a second part is, yes, the government is not barred from trying him on the criminal side, but there may be some exposure, there may be some liability for the government's kidnapping of him and a potential tort claim, a lawsuit against the United States. And in 1994 or a couple of years after this, I think Machain did file a lawsuit. And that's when you kind of got involved when you were clerking with Judge Davies. Judge Davies had a portion of that suit in his courtroom, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And that was an interesting case because the U.S. Supreme Court, in their decision in the criminal case, sending it back and saying, yeah, you can be tried. And then Judge Rafeedie dismissed the case mid-trial without letting it go to the jury. So he was acquitted. In the U.S. Supreme Court case, they said, well, to the extent that this is conduct that is, misconduct by the government, he can sue civilly. So Alvarez-Machain took up that cue and he sued the government under what's called the Alien Tort Claims Act, and I think under the Federal Tort Claims Act. He sued the government agents. He sued some of the people involved in the kidnapping itself, the Mexican nationals. That case again went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Judge Davies tried the original motions in that case for summary judgment. The Supreme Court, at the end of the day, said, yeah, you know what? Actually, you don't have a case under the Alien Tort Claims Act and the Federal Tort Claims Act, and they reversed the civil claim as well. And so at the end of the day, Alvarez-Machain, I think, won about $25,000 against one of the defendants named Sosa, who was one of the former police officers that was involved in the abduction of Alvarez-Machain, and that was it.
And he, if I'm not mistaken, was a Mexican national. He was, right?
Yeah, he was one of the former police officers that were hired.
Yeah, and one thing you touched on there, Sean, I got to ask Mark what he thinks about this as the Law and Order guy. Judge Rafeedie, the trial judge at the criminal trial, he initially dismissed the indictment. He was reversed on appeal. The case goes to trial. The government concludes their case in chief. And of course, I think, Sean, you tell me or you tell us, is it kind of a boilerplate that the defense will always make a motion for summary judgment after the government puts on a case, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
Absolutely. And it's almost always denied.
Right. So the defense argues for summary judgment that the government did not meet its burden.
And Bill, for the audience and Sean, you might want to explain to anybody who may not know what a summary judgment is.
Go
Yeah.
ahead,
So
Sean. Yeah.
the actual term for it is a directed verdict. In the federal system, it's called a Rule 29. It's the same statute, same sort of standard in the state, which is after the government has presented its case during a jury trial, the defense will make a motion before putting on their case that says, no reasonable jury could convict under this evidence, and therefore, judge, you should not let it go to the jury, and instead you should rule that the case, a directed verdict for the defendant in this case, because it's so bad, it shouldn't even allow a jury to decide it. And that's what Judge Rafeedie did in this case. The standard for that, is pretty high. It means there's no reasonable interpretation of the evidence from which a jury could convict. And so that was the rule that was made. It was a directed verdict under Rule 29. That is not appealable by the government. It operates as an acquittal. And that was the end of the case.
That's fascinating. I mean, the fact that that's not appealable by the government, I did not know that. Mark, how do you feel about that, especially when you know that the judge dismissed first of all, a grand jury, a federal grand jury indicted Alvarez-Machain, right?
Right.
The judge threw out the indictment. He was reversed. So I don't know how he felt about that. But after the government puts on their case, he dismisses it and it's not appealable by the government. So he walks away. What do you think when you hear something I mean, Sean, that's pretty uncommon before even Mark answers, isn't it?
It is uncommon.
Yeah, Mark, what do you think about that?
Well, you know what, to your question and to Sean's point about it being uncommon, Bill, that's exactly how I feel about it. In other words, and Sean laid it out very well, that the circumstances have to be extraordinary. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've heard the term, I understand what it means, and that's why I've never seen it and never saw it in my career, because the threshold is so high for a judge to say there's no possible way that 12 reasonable people could find this person guilty of the charges brought against him or her. It's so extraordinarily rare. So why this judge would do this? I mean, to me, it seems like in a case like this, that a judge would have to have a predisposition, there has to be some bias in my mind, whether it's personal or it's political or it's legal bias. there has to be some bias in a case like this. So I just find it bizarre that that would happen. Um, and you would think that I think most judges would say, listen, I don't agree with this. I think this is unconstitutional, or I think it's a violation of the treaty, blah, blah, whatever, whatever, whatever. But that's kind of above my head. My job
Mm.
is to rule on the evidence, is to rule on this case, not the ancillary issues that surround this case about whether he was brought here legally or against the treaty or not. That's not for him, to focus on. The case is brought against him by a grand jury legally within procedure, and then you do your job in that specific role. You can't make decisions based on what you think may have happened outside that courtroom or outside of your specific role in judging on the evidence presented. That's my take on it. And he fouled up, but at that point, the cat's out of the bag, so to speak, and nothing that the government can do about it.
Yeah. And, at that point in time, Sean, in the federal system, at least, not hard to indict someone. A little different today. I think the public is a little more demanding today and asks a lot more questions today. Back then, when you're talking about the murder of a law enforcement officer, the evidence needed to secure an indictment, probably not what that grand jury would require today, I would guess. But still an unusual situation, right?
Yeah, I mean, this was a case that had a lot of public attention. And so, I wasn't involved in that prosecution. Obviously, it was before my time.
Yep.
This was a high priority of the DEA all the way to headquarters and with the attorney general. I don't know what the state of the evidence was in front of Rafeedie. I read some of the reports of the court decisions, and including from the civil case afterwards. But that's the decision he made, and that's it. As a government prosecutor, you're done at that point. There's nothing you can do.
Right. All right. So let's, with that case as a background now, let's jump ahead to this past July. And even Mark, you and I haven't really sat down and talked about this. July 25th, Santa Teresa, New Mexico, a Beechcraft King Air lands. No tail numbers on the plane, by the way. Interesting. And Joaquin Guzman Lopez is on the plane, and he was expected, for at least a couple days. His arrival was planned. He had been negotiating for quite some time to turn himself in and cut a deal with the United States government. Potentially a deal that includes his brother, one of his brothers who's already in custody in the United States, Ovidio. Whatever the case, the strange part is that there's someone else on the plane with him, Mark, and it's Mayo Zambada, Ismael Zambada Garcia. And, at first there was a story put out that he was lured, which is a legal term, at least as far as the Department of Justice is concerned. He was lured onto the plane under the premise that Joaquin was going to take him to see some real estate in Mexico, in northern Mexico, and that turned out not to be actually the story. And even Attorney General Garland now has been speaking to state and local law enforcement groups around the country, and I've heard from some of those people that, he just tells it like it is. He arrived on the plane with zip ties on his, zip tied to the seat, more or less, or at least zip tied hands and feet, and a black bag over his head, and that he was kidnapped by Joaquin. And I talked about the actual kidnapping that took place in Sinaloa, where several of his bodyguards were killed, et cetera, et cetera. But he's here now, right? So, I guess, Sean, first off, when he first appeared in court, his defense made the same kind of strong arguments that we heard in the Alvarez case, right? Said that he did not voluntarily come here. He was not tricked into coming here. He was kidnapped. Your thoughts when you saw that with your experience on the previous case.
Yeah, there's some amazing parallels to make that claim. And he's clearly going to make a claim based on the way that he was rendered to the United States. The first hurdle for him is going to be, was Joaquin operating as an agent of the United States? Because that has been the prerequisite in all of these cases we've talked about. In Alvarez-Machain, Judge Rafeedie found during the motions that the DEA had paid the guys who kidnapped Alvarez-Machain, and they were U.S. government agents, as a matter of fact. And so that hasn't been established here. It's unclear what the negotiations were between the U.S. government and Joaquin Guzman, whether or not there was any promises of leniency for cooperation or any other considerations for bringing in El Mayo. Clearly, Guzman hoped that El Mayo would give him a big bargaining chip, but whether he was promised anything for doing that is an issue. And if he's not an agent of the government, he doesn't have a claim. But if he is, then the same issues that were in Alvarez-Machain will probably come up. One will be outrageous governmental misconduct. But again, to prove that claim, El Mayo is going to have to show that the government did something so outrageous, like torturing him, that it was essentially beyond all bounds of reason. So far, I haven't heard any claims that El Mayo was beaten or tortured or anything, severe to the extent that it might seem to qualify as outrageous governmental misconduct. That doesn't stop the defense from bringing a motion and trying to suss out what exactly was done. There are some murders behind this, and there's all kinds of weirdness in Mexico that happened when he was abducted.
Right.
But that didn't happen to El Mayo, apparently. And so those questions, right? Those questions remain to be answered. But that's the outrageous governmental misconduct claim. As to the extradition treaty, Mexico has still not agreed with the United States to alter the treaty to include an anti-kidnap provision. There was a lot of movement to do that after Alvarez-Machain, and Mexico did not want to give up its right not to extradite nationals, but to try them locally in Mexico. So the U.S. government wouldn't agree. And although it became a huge international sort of issue diplomatically, legally, the landscape hasn't changed. And so I think that in the United States, in a federal court, if they are presented with the issue, the decision in Alvarez-Machain is likely to control, to say it doesn't matter how you got here, you're here, and it's not a defense to the jurisdiction of the United States to try you for crimes that you don't like the way that you were rendered.
Interesting. Were you going to say something, Mark?
Well, I was just thinking about the parallels and the differences. The parallels, I think, outweigh the differences here, but the differences are important. I think one is, if the DEA, now we're talking 32 years apart in these cases, but they're significant cases. They are milestone cases, certainly the 192. It sets the precedent for everything that follows because of the summary dismissal by the judgment by that judge. I would think historically, there are enough people within the agency that are looking back in the old files saying, listen, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it differently. It has to be very secreted. There has to be a number of firewalls between the third floor and what happens in Mexico. And so we can't have any emails. We can't have any texts. We can't have any. So we could have theoretically here, it's not a conspiracy. I'm just thinking, how can they do this carefully? You could have informants talking to informants, talking to informants, talking to Guzman about this. And, part of a deal saying, listen, if anything ever comes up about the DA being behind this, your brother's staying in prison for the rest of his life, period. There will be no deal cut. So again, I'm talking out of my rear end here. I'm just thinking from a practical point of view, how would the government, the U.S. government, in light of what happened in 92 with this judgment from the judge, how would they go about preventing that next again? I would guess there was probably some insulation between the decision makers and the DEA and what happened with however this person got back to the United States or Mexico. I would imagine that's going to be a little hard to make the connection, at least harder than it was 32 years ago.
Yeah, one interesting thing about that, I recently looked up the Department of Justice manual on extradition. There is a section dedicated specifically to the Alvarez-Machain case. And what it says is not that U.S. agents shall not kidnap foreign nationals to render them for justice in the United States. What it says, and it gives a little bit of background on the case, what it says is it has to be approved at very high levels in the Department of Justice. They know that this is a huge hot button issue, and I'm sure there are several lessons learned from Alvarez-Machain that the agents involved in this case involving El Mayo were very aware of when they put this together.
Yeah, and I can speak to that. The approvals needed. I mean, I think of the case of Salvador Cienfuegos, the Secretary of Defense. Have you heard of that one, Sean?
Yes.
Yeah.
His arrest in
Unfortunately, I
LA?
was involved in that one, and that was one where an arrest warrant was obtained. He was indicted by a grand jury, Eastern District of New York, and all those approvals from DOJ were obtained prior to him being arrested. But it still caused such turmoil with the relationship with the Mexican government that a decision was made to drop the case in the United States with the promise that, the thing you mentioned earlier, that Mexico would charge him for the crimes there, which of course they never did, right?
Correct. Correct.
Yeah, so we can see where politics comes in. Sean, let's kind of get in the weeds a little bit about a couple things that I heard you say. First, so people understand, when we're talking about an agent of the government,
Yeah.
if Joaquin is negotiating his surrender, and if part of that surrender, if there is discussions and there is an agreement with the U.S. government that Mayo Zambada is going to come with him, he doesn't mention how. It's just he says, "I think I can get Mayo Zambada to come with me."
Yeah.
So then he's acting as an agent of the government when he does this. Does that
Maybe.
change
Maybe.
anything? Or what
Go
does
ahead,
that?
Bill.
Yeah, I don't know that he necessarily is. I mean, the government, for him to be acting as a government agent, they have to be exercising some particular control over what he's
Okay.
doing. So in Alvarez-Machain, one of the interesting things reported in the civil cases was DEA contacted an informant in Mexico who then recruited this team, and DEA gave them very specific instructions: you will not harm Alvarez-Machain. They were directing how this was going to go down, and they paid for it, and they gave instructions as to how to do it. It's not clear that a cooperation agreement that doesn't specify, and you're going to kidnap El Mayo and bring him to the United States, makes Joaquin Guzman a government agent. I mean, there's gray areas depending on how the facts pan out. And obviously the defense will argue maybe it was implied based on the context of the negotiations. But I don't think just the fact that there was talk about cooperation necessarily makes Guzman an agent of the United States. But it's an issue that's going to be litigated, I bet.
Interesting.
And
Go
Bill,
ahead,
I'd like
Mark.
to chime in. I read the entire Supreme Court ruling on the first case, and from 1992,
Yeah.
and read a couple articles on the current case with Guzman and El Mayo. And like you said, Sean, I think there's so much more gray area, let's put it this way: there's so much gray area, because I don't think there was any gray area in 1992. With this one, I think there's a ton of, was he or wasn't he? Was there implication? Was there nudging? But like you said, going from that to actually being an agent in the eyes of a judge, and I said there's a lot there to talk about.
Yeah.
And Sean, what about I mean, I've heard 4 murders, somewhere between 4, possibly 6 murders actually committed when he was actually kidnapped. His security team killed, and I don't know if it was just hired gunmen, law enforcement working for the cartel, military working for the cartel. I don't have that level of detail. But does that, you mentioned that earlier, but does that shed any impact on this one way or another, that there was, a serious loss of life during this kidnapping? Could a judge look at that and say that that's egregious?
The context is always important. It could play a part, but my instinct, based on my reading of the cases, is, El Mayo has to be able to claim that there was outrageous government misconduct directed at him personally. Otherwise, he doesn't really have what's called standing to raise that issue, right? And so, obviously, context is always important factually for a court deciding these issues. But assuming that El Mayo was not beaten, that the worst that happened to him is that he had a hood put over his head, and he was zip tied and put on a plane and flown to the U.S. That doesn't sound like the kind of outrageous governmental misconduct that is talked about in the case law that would require a reversal. And so, yeah, it's important that there was some murders there. And frankly, I'm skeptical, if they were acting as agents of the DEA, that the DEA would have authorized murders in the context of an abduction. That doesn't sound right. And so it sounds more like this was something that Guzman put together himself in the hopes of getting favorable treatment by the U.S. But, those facts will play out in a court probably.
And then finally, I guess the possibility of a civil suit against the U.S. government by Zambada. And I
Yeah.
mean, you have a little more direct experience with that. If he can't claim outrageous government misconduct, is there even a civil suit there? Or could he claim he was deprived of liberty because he was kidnapped and brought here and now he's standing trial?
I don't think so, because essentially the Supreme Court has said, Fourth Amendment doesn't apply outside of the United States, at least in this context. And so even assuming he gets past the argument that Joaquin was acting as an agent of the United States, the fact there was a warrant out for El Mayo's arrest in the United States. It was a valid warrant, and there's a pending, actually more than one valid case. So as the U.S. said in Alvarez-Machain, how he gets here is not going to deprive the U.S. of jurisdiction to try him for the crimes that he's been indicted for. And so he might be able to sue, but I think those claims are tougher, especially after Alvarez-Machain.
What about this, Sean? You mentioned the DOJ handbook and the portion on kidnapping or on the Machain case. I don't know whether we don't know what approvals were obtained, but would that make a difference? Let's say there were no approvals obtained and this thing went down absent the Department of Justice approvals that are mentioned in the handbook.
That may not make a difference, because if local agents of the United States, like the local DEA in El Paso or wherever else indictments were pending, or HSI, who I think actually took custody of him, if they approved it, then that would transform the persons that they told to do it into agents of the United States to the extent that they exercised control over them. The fact that they may have been acting rogue doesn't necessarily deprive them of their authority as federal agents to do that. It means they violated policy.
Right.
It probably doesn't mean they've violated a law. And so I think the U.S. is still on the hook if they actually did employ Guzman as an agent.
So finally, Sean, as we wrap it up, where do you think this ends up? Just your opinion. I mean, obviously we're not in the weeds and we don't know the details, but from what is publicly out there, where do you think this ends up?
I don't think it's going to be a good defense for El Mayo. There's a number of interesting changes that have happened since Alvarez-Machain. One of the things you don't see here, and you mentioned this earlier, so far, the government of Mexico has not lodged a protest over the rendition. They've asked for more information, but as far as I've seen from the reporting, they have not lodged an official protest. They did that twice in the Alvarez-Machain case. That did play a part in that case. Ultimately, the Supreme Court said it didn't make a difference, but it did play a part. That hasn't happened here. That tells you something politically is different that's going on right now. The other thing that is interesting is right after Alvarez-Machain, Mexico changed its statutes to include in their treason statute anyone who abducts a Mexican national to render them to a foreign government. That law was passed specifically as a result of Alvarez-Machain. And in fact, it looks like the Mexican government, based on reporting, has made moves to actually issue a warrant for Joaquin Guzman for exactly that crime. That's an interesting difference.
Right.
A lot of the things you hear in the case law discussing these things are, hey, you know what? We're not going to not try this guy for his crimes, but if you want the guys who kidnapped him, then give us an extradition request and maybe we'll render them back to you. That's a remedy that is possible. Now, Joaquin Guzman is already going to be indicted and tried here in the United States. Who knows if that will ever happen? But that is some of the context of what's going on. And I think part of why the Mexican government is making this move to indict him or charge him with treason.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Mark, any questions as we wrap it up?
No, it's a fascinating cases, plural, but Sean, you've been very, very informative and, right to the point, crystal clear, but they are fascinating and it'll be interesting to see how this all turns out.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Sean, thanks for your time on this one. Some very interesting similarities you were able to draw with the Machain case from 30 plus years ago. We'll stay in touch and we'll see as this one goes through the courts. Maybe we'll jump back on again and see where we're at.
Be my pleasure.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.